today, like I said, what we're going to, of course, be discussing today, I'm going to kind of continue, talking about ancient China and its Yellow River civilization that's in East Asia. Of course, we're going to concentrate more on the imperial dynasties that first gets established in ancient China. Primarily, I'm going to talk about some of the first early ones like the Qin Dynasty, the Han. I'll also get into talk about also a little about the Tang Dynasty that was around as well. Anyway, from last time, of course, we were talking about, ancient China and all that. And I was kind of getting into the background of China. We kind of went into and discussed the geography of China, which is, based in East Asia, around that Yellow River Valley region, that's so-called North China Plain, is where China got started. And then we talked about some of the early dynasties of China, like I think we talked about the Shang was one of the first one. We also talked about the Zhou dynasty as well. And I think the last thing I did is I talked about some of the Chinese philosophical movements like Confucianism, Taoism, that was kind of big in ancient China. Well, I want to kind of shift gears today and kind of get into talking about China and the fact that they have these imperial dynasties that start coming in roughly around the 3rd century BC, which China's got emperors that rule over China for over 2,000 years. Emperors, more of a centralized power around a powerful emperor. And of course, one of the first I'm going to talk about today is, of course, the so-called rise of the Qin, also known as the Qin as well. It's a kingdom and dynasty that becomes what we call the Empire of China. It's also where the name China comes from. We'll see later from that particular dynasty that will rule over China. You kind of see kind of a wider picture of course, this particular dynasty and empire that they will rule. And I'll get to the famous, first ruler of it, Emperor Wang Di, of course, who takes over China at that time. But if you remember correctly, we had talked about how prior to this, they had that so-called warring states period where China was, broken up into all these different feudal states that were at war with each other over many years. Well, what happened over time was this other state we talked about, which is the Qin, or also called Qin, eventually overwhelmed all the other states and conquered them and kind of absorbed them into one state in the eastern part of China. And so by about 221 BC, they believed that this particular kingdom formed what became the so-called Chinese Empire. And so the name China, of course, was born from that, of course, afterwards. I've got pictures showing the first emperor, of course, of this dynasty and empire, of course, that would rule. He goes by different names, Qin Shi Huang Di, or just Emperor Wang. I guess they often called him as well. He didn't rule that long. He was only in power like maybe about 15 years, but he's seen as the founder of the dynasty, founder of imperial China, also as well. Now I'll get to it later. He was kind of ruthless. He was. We'll talk about how he built the Great Wall of China and all that, and probably killed a lot of people in the construction of it throughout his country. And his empire is getting pretty large in size. The size of probably, I guess, about China at that time is about maybe a quarter of the size of the current People's Republic of China. So if you go back to that map I was just showing you a second ago, you can see that the empire was mostly based in the eastern central part of China, kind of going down to the southern coast, close to where Hong Kong is, basically. And also creeping, I guess, towards like Korea and Manchuria over here as well. So that's basically the small area. This one's kind of like a little larger, but I don't know if it was that big in size with that particular map. But I think that map's a little better than the other one of what's more accurate. Now, one of the things that, of course, he's very famous for, of course, Emperor Wang Di, is the fact that he was very famous for constructing the Great Wall of China. which, as you know, is really, they think the construction of it began maybe around the 3rd century, although they think that a lot of the early construction of fortifications like this went back to the Warring States period, where a lot of states were building fortifications on their northern borders. And a lot of the early, constructed walls of this fortification was mostly built using rammed earth, as you saw basically in that short documentary and from the Smithsonian Channel. So they think he's kind of credited with kind of starting it. And of course, we need to talk about like why was the Great Wall constructed? Like they talked about in the video, was the fact that China was being invaded by various barbarians that were in the north, which the main group of people that were trying to attack them were the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were these Asiatic peoples that lived in the Mongolian steppe, kind of between China and Mongolia. And it's kind of debated about how they're related to the Mongols. Some people think they're related to the Mongols and also the Huns later that attacked Europe, like when the Roman Empire existed. But the Xiongnu were very good horsemen that fought with like composite bow. As you saw in that little short video. And so they began attacking him from the north. And so the Chinese realized they needed some kind of linear fortress that could basically stop them, because they realized they couldn't keep attacking them back and forth with their military, because it was draining their forces. And so they thought that was the best way to stop them. There's different names, of course, for the Great Wall. Of course, the Great Wall term today is more of a modernized name. Like people in the West, I guess Europeans that came to China in modern times started calling it such a great wall. So they kind of use it that name, or Grand Wall, whatever we want to call it, basically. The Chinese have their own names for the wall. One is the 10,000 li wall, which a li is a type of measurement in Chinese that means like half a kilometer. So that would equal to like 5,000 kilometers. So 5,000 kilometer wall. One li chang'an, or Changqing, whatever you want to say it like that, is also another name. They call it also as well, which is the long wall of 10,000 is what it also means. Other names too. Chinese wall is another name that's kind of popular as well. Wall of death, because there was a theory that millions of workers were used to build it, and a lot of them were buried in the wall as it was being built. And so the joke was that it was the longest cemetery on earth, which that's actually something they've never proven, though, about the Great Wall, that people were buried in it. I think they've tried to kind of dig into the wall and find that there's people in there buried, but actually they've never proven that. But some claim that close to 1 million workers may have died in the construction of the Great Wall. And obviously, going back to Emperor Huangdi, he forced a lot of these people to, like peasants or whatever, to work on the wall. I've got other images, by the way, showing the Great Wall that I can kind of share with you a little bit today. They think they had at one point, at least with the Great Wall of China, maybe close to about 25,000 of these watchtowers that were built at one point along the wall, like to protect the wall. So if a section of the wall gets attacked, they have troops that are in these little mini fortresses that can basically go and try to stop them and protect the wall right there. The amount of course, you're looking at the later Great Wall that was built by the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty later constructed the wall that you're looking at because of the fact that the Mongols invaded China and took it over. They kicked them out, and they were trying to prevent them from invading again. And so between the 1500s, they used millions and millions of basically brick to create this huge linear fortification we're talking about. Now, I think they say that they used almost 4 billion brick and the actual construction of the actual Great Wall. I think they say, I think up to the time of before it fell to the Manchu in the 17th century, that the Chinese used about 250,000 soldiers to man the whole wall. So obviously it absorbed a lot of their military into protecting their northern frontier. By the way, the average height of the wall is around 25 feet tall. So it gives you an idea how tall the wall was. But the actual width of the wall, maybe around 15, 20 feet, maybe on average. But I think some walls average up to maybe 25, 30 feet wide overall. The wall itself goes from like the Yellow Sea, like actually part of the actual wall goes to close to where the North Korean border is. Then it goes all the way west to where the Gobi Desert is. So the varies on the miles on it, but I think it's like 4,000 or 5,000 miles is usually considered the length of the wall. But there's other sections of the wall that have been added to it, over time by multiple dynasties, like over, 2,000 years or whatever it was built, and almost 2,000 years. And I think the number of walls, I think I've read somewhere, is like it might have like 30,000 miles of walls, like of all walls combined, over multiple centuries. So it's crazy the amount of construction that went into the building of this wall. However, what happened was the wall became obsolete in the 17th century. What happened was the Manchurian peoples, which is the Manchu, invaded China and took it over, forming the Qing or Great Qin Dynasty, it's called sometimes. And after that, all of China became like a huge empire that stretched all over where it is now today. Like the size of China now was pretty much combined by the 17th century. And so it became obsolete. Nobody used the wall anymore after that. And so now the Great Wall of China has become more really of a tourist attraction, is what it is today. All right, so let me also talk about something else, some other things that Emperor Huangdi was also known for. He had a capital he built too in central China that was called Xi'an or Xianyang, or either one. And later it's called Chang'an, I think under the Tang Dynasty is what they start calling it later. It's now got a population of 12 million people. Remember, I think I told you that Chang'an was one of, or Xi'an, called either one, was basically one of, at one point, like 4 major capitals of China. Beijing, of course, now being the most famous today in modern China. Chang'an, I'll get to it later, was where, the Silk Road started. I think I mentioned maybe about this before, a little bit before, but Chang'an was actually a capital of China for almost 1,200 years, like up to the time of the Tang Dynasty. So throughout the golden age of China later, this time, that's basically where China's central part of their empire was at the time. Supposedly, Emperor Huangdi constructed this huge mausoleum, like a tomb, to where he would be buried. He didn't reign very long, but 15, 20 years. And he used something like 700,000 workers to actually build it. And if you know about this tomb, it was guarded by this famous so-called terracotta army that you may have heard about, which was a statue army of like something like 8,000 soldiers, included even statue chariots, and they had like horses that were part of it as well. And it kind of depicted his armies in his, I guess, city of, of Xi'an at the time during his reign. And now today, it's like a big tourist attraction. It was originally found in the 1970s, around 1974, I believe it is, by some local Chinese farmers who accidentally dug it up. And so they found all these statues that were buried there. And a lot of these were supposed to be, they think, soldiers that were in Emperor Huangdi's armies. Kind of blow it up more right here. But you can see here that they're kind of like life-size type statues, like the size of real people. And I think they seem to think that a lot of the statues that they used with the terracotta army were actually from real men that were in his army, because if you look at a lot of the statues, they seem to kind of look a little different than each other, and even have maybe some different hairstyles and things like that. So they think each one of these, they actually may have had soldiers that actually may have stood for the actual statues to be made. So it's interesting about that. Oh, that is. He was kind of a weird ruler. I think if you study about Emperor Wang Di, I think he tried to search for immortality or something like that, and drank different elixirs and things like that. With his tomb, which is really weird, some of the workers that knew, I guess, the best secrets about it, they were buried alive in it, so they couldn't find their way out or anything like that. And under him, he began to adopt a new form of philosophy in the empire, which you may have heard about. So I think I've got it up here somewhere. It's called legalism. Legalism is a type of Chinese philosophy where, it involved this idea of a centralized bureaucracy where it's around a very powerful ruler, which of course became emperor. But he was very against, they didn't like various Chinese philosophies. Like Confucianism was banned in the country. They banned like Taoism. They banned various books throughout the country. And you had scholars actually killed, like buried alive. So he only wanted people to know essential things like medicine, farming, that he thought was important to run the state. He didn't want anybody to know any new stuff, I guess, that might change things. Under legalism, how it worked basically was they believed in using strict laws against the population because they thought that most humans were more concerned about their own self-interest. They tend to do bad things more than good, and so they concentrated more on strict punishment for people that disobeyed laws versus actually rewarding people for doing good things. So that's kind of how they did things under him. So capital crimes, were pretty prevalent under him. People being put to death for different things, buried or burned to death, maybe. However, a lot of this was later abandoned, when they brought in Confucianism, especially under the Han Dynasty. That'll come in next. But under him, he was kind of a ruthless emperor. Now, he is considered, by the way, one of the most infamous emperors. A lot of people don't like him in China today. Still don't. Not really like any of the emperors, I guess, now in China now because they have communism or whatever. But he was considered a ruthless emperor when he was in power. All right. Also, now they had another dynasty that followed his, which didn't last long. The Qin or Qin Dynasty only lasted like a few years. I think his sons may have reigned briefly, but they had this other dynasty that came in next, which was called the Han Dynasty. Basically, the Han overthrew them, like in some kind of rebellion around 206 BC in China. And it starts what they call the Chinese Golden Age, which lasts, they think, around the 3rd century BC to about the 10th century CE. So about maybe close to 1,100 years or so is how long the Han Dynasty is. The Han Dynasty, by the way, is the longest dynasty in Chinese history, at least in the imperial dynasties of China. It's around 400 years, basically. It's founded by this man named Liu Bang, who was a Chinese commoner and a general that was under the Chinese state. He took over. And later, I think I've got a picture showing him. He has different names that he goes by, but later on, he's called they call him, it's right here, Emperor Gao Su, or Ko Su is what they call him, or Liu Bang. But Gao Su was more of a name he was called after he had died. I think it means exalted emperor, or they would call him Han Gao Su, which exalted emperor of the Han, basically. And there's another picture of him right there. But he would reign about maybe close to around 20 years that you're looking at right there. Another translation is High Founder. I think I've seen that one also of kind of what it means, but he's one that starts the actual dynasty in the state of the Han that rules over China. And under him, one of the things that the Han start to do is they start to make reforms to the state. If you remember, they had legalism, of course, under the Qin Dynasty that they had before. Well, at this time, they decided to basically scrap that, and they brought in Confucianism. So Confucianism became basically one of the main philosophies that becomes dominant in the Chinese state, with the government, within society. They even began to enact things that Confucius had talked about before, previously, like the idea of using merit for why people should be in government. Use of civil service exams also were initiated as well. So these are all things that they started under the Han state after that. Han Dynasty, that state had a lot of influence on imperial China overall. Now, they had different emperors. I was showing that emperor had before, which was right here. Emperor Wu, or the Emperor Wu of the Han, he's considered one of the most famous of the Chinese emperors that reigned. We have got more than one picture of him right there. There's a map, by the way, showing the Han state. You can see right here. You can see they may have had a population close to 60 million people at one point. 206 BC to about 220. So yeah, roughly close to about 400 years is how long they were in power overall. They are the ones that they considered to start the so-called Golden Age, like I said. But Wu, Emperor Wu, was considered, also called Wu Di or Wu Ti, was considered one of the greatest emperors of the Han. He reigned not the longest reigning emperor of China. They think he's the second longest reigning emperor in Chinese history. You can see he reigned from 141 to 87 BC. So that's about a period you can see of about 54 years that he was in power. Under him, one of the things that happened, of course, with China is that China began to expand. A lot of it was due to his military successes as a ruler. Some people call him the martial emperor or military style emperor as the ruler of China during that time. And if you look at that map there, you can see how China begins to expand westward into like Western China. You can see they go into also northeastern part of China. And they also push into Korea and also into, they think, I guess be today, the northern part of Vietnam. So under him, China starts to expand as an imperial power at the time. The Han also under Emperor Wu were successful in defeating the Xiongnu. They pushed them back into the Gobi Desert. It's probably his most great success also. And with that, what happened was they believe the Han began to extend and build off of the Great Wall of China that the previous Qin Dynasty had been working on. They think that's one of the things that led to the development of the Silk Road, which the Great Wall was partially being built to protect it. So yeah, they may have had, at that point, you can see in that map there, if you look there, you can see that the capital was basically called Chang'an, or that's going to be the name they'll eventually call it later, right there in the middle. And Chang'an, I'll get to it later, was considered to be, by the way, one of the first million man populated cities overall. Of course, the big thing that starts from him, Chang'an is very important, that city, that capital, because that's where the Silk Road begins. From there, it goes east to west towards other parts of Asia, towards Europe and Africa. They do think that Emperor Wu helped facilitate a lot of the early trade that they think started the Silk Road. I don't know if 130 BC is the exact date of when they think they started, but they do seem to think that the Silk Road likely got started sometime close to about that time in the 2nd century. And the actual trade route itself goes several thousand miles. I don't know exact how many miles it is, but 4, 5, 6,000 miles. I guess it depends how far west you're going towards Europe and Africa. But it does link up a lot of parts of Asia, India, Persia, Mesopotamia, and those areas around the Middle East, like around Turkey. Those areas are kind of linked up with trade eventually with the East. You got important cities like Damascus, right? That's in Syria, Constantinople, that's in like around Turkey, and then later Rome, which is in Italy also as well. So you got some, caravan routes running into Africa, and even trade routes running towards Italy, of course, in Europe. And under the Han Dynasty, you had the Han state actually traded with the Roman Empire that was, in the West. That's something that's kind of going on. So there's a lot of different types of trade going that way, and continues that way up into like the Middle Ages and early modern times as well, because you got Marco Polo from Italy that eventually goes to China, by the 13th century. Besides silk, that's the main thing that came down, obviously, the Silk Road that, made its famous and got its name, Silk Road or Silk Route. But things like gunpowder, paper, porcelain, glass, spices, teas, pearls, all those kind of things that came from Asia, technologies, compass or whatever that came from China. All those, of course, spread westward eventually. You can see diseases. Yeah, that's true about that. I think bubonic plague, they think, may have originated in China or in Asia, and they think spread down the so-called Silk Road to Europe and ended up causing the Black Death. They think later. So, diseases have spread a lot from Asia. It's true about like the swine flu, I think it's something that's spread from parts of Asia also as well. And most recently, of course, we had COVID, right? That spread also from, they think, Asia, at least they made from China. This is the theory they think of where it came from. The Chinese, by the way, are very mistrustful. Like a lot of your Asian states in like Asia, like you've got Japan, like in China, some of these others are very xenophobic. They're kind of don't trust foreigners quite a lot. So, a lot of these things that they made, like silk and gunpowder, they tried to keep it secretive for many, many years. However, eventually, I think by medieval modern times, a lot of these things came out, and now they know, of course, what silk's made from the silkworm, and gunpowder's made from different ingredients like saltpeter and so on. And so eventually these things got out, especially the gunpowder part, I think was the big one. So that's probably the most famous thing they invented, likely. So now the Han are known for different technologies. Like I think we've kind of talked about some of these. Here's, by the way, a map showing you again the route you want to know. That's kind of the basic route of the Silk Road right here, which goes from China. You can see kind of close to India and Persia, and then you can see it goes into the Middle East, into the Mediterranean region. So that's the basic route of the Silk Road. But obviously, the Silk Road has different roads. Some go like up into Mongolia, up into the north, and some go probably into India, Arabia, and you got caravan routes, of course, also going into, Africa and things like that as well. So I kind of showing that real quick. But Han achievements. Yeah, the Han, of course, they think were known for all kinds of things. I think they say the most famous thing that the Han created was paper, and obviously printing, like printing books. That's the thing that they're really well known for. So they started taking like things like bamboo and mulberry trees and things like that, and making them into like paper, like sheets of paper, and creating books, like in the long scrolls. You can see there, iron plow, wheelbarrow. Those are things that they think they helped to kind of invent. That was well known as well. Seismograph may have been invented by them. Acupuncture, You can see the compass, sundial, water mill, ship's rudder. Those are all things that the Han may have invented at one point. But some of these inventions have been around, like in the West, like Egypt had things like sundials. They're kind of similar. Greco-Roman times they had water mills and things like that. I think also as well. But those are things that they're kind of known for. Also, the Han were one of the first to really develop like standardized Chinese. Like I know, like first, I guess dictionaries, like books of Chinese language or writing, as well calligraphy, writing, of course, at that time. Right, I'm going to also move on. We're also going to talk about this other dynasty they had later. I'm going to get to the Tang, but the Han does divide its actual historical period into two periods. They have the so-called former Han that they have, and they also have what they call the latter Han or later Han, really later Han. And apparently there was a rebellion under them where one of the ministers that was under the Han named Wang Mang overthrew the actual state and formed his own dynasty called the Qin Dynasty. And he ruled for like 14, 15 years as the only ruler of the Qin Dynasty. And the Han overthrew them and then continued after that for another almost 200 years. And so that's why you got these two divided periods of the Han Dynasty. And it's kind of, most people don't know about that, but it's something kind of want to talk about briefly about that that did exist. Now, after the Han was around to about 220 CE. There was a brief state they had that was called, well, actually two states called the Northern Wei, and they had another one called the Sui dynasties, which didn't have too many emperors of that particular dynasties. And the one that became more famous, of course, was a dynasty called the Tang Dynasty, which came in around the 7th century. It's actually part of a period, sometimes called the so-called Three Kingdoms period, which occurs after the Han collapsed in 220. Northern Wei, the Sui dynasty, and then the Tang dynasty came in. The Sui dynasty, I think, only had two emperors. They were part of it, and it wasn't around very long. I think it was only around about, I want to say it was around like 40 years, the Sui state, and then the Tang took over. The Tang was an imperial dynasty, which was like the peak state of the golden age of China, which I think kind of ends around the 10th century CE or AD. And so you can see they were around for almost 300 years, ruling from the capital of Chang'an, which, by the way, they called it that. I think originally the name was Xi'an or Xi'an Yang. Is what they call it. Xi'an is what they call it now, today. But Chang'an was a Tang name, which meant perpetual peace, is what it meant. And it had a population at one point, at least under the Tang, of 2 million people that lived there. And I think they say that the Tang was, they think that that particular city was one of the first million-man populations to actually be in the world. Like somewhere between 1 and 2 million at one point. The Tang population is like 50, 60 million, about probably what it was at that time. Why is this Tang state important? They think it was the peak of Chinese art, like poetry, literature, music, things like that in ancient China. And it also saw the spread of a lot of your philosophies, which kind of were not everywhere, but eventually by the Tang dynasty, things like Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, all those types of philosophical movements all spread throughout all of ancient China, and even was spread outside of China as well, going into like Vietnam, Korea, Japan, etc. I think there was like more than 10 emperors they had in China. I'll kind of go through some of the famous emperors that they had of the Tang dynasty. I think most of the early ones were famous in the first century or two. The one on the far left is an emperor named Emperor Gaosu, whose original name was Li Wan. He was actually the founder of the actual Tang dynasty, which was founded around 618. And that's, by the way, is a typo, just realized right there. That should be CE. Excuse me. So he reigned from 618 CE up to about, he didn't reign very long, only about a few years you can see there. And he overthrew the Sioux state, which I think had been before there, and through a rebellion and then founded it. The one in the middle is Emperor Tai Song, or Tai Song of Tang, they call him sometimes. He was the son of Emperor Gao Su of the Tang, and he was considered to be one of the actual emperors that started the whole golden age of China, and is really considered one of the greatest of the Tang emperors that they had overall. Then the one on the right, most people don't know about her. Usually Wu Zetian, or really Wu Cho, or I guess they call her Wu Chao, because either way you say it, I guess, is basically considered the only major female empress in China's history that actually ruled as an actual emperor. She actually was a mistress of one of the emperors, Emperor Gao Song, and then became like his wife. And then after he died, she basically took over the state, and I think she reigned for close to like 40 years at one point. I think she was even the kind of like the de facto ruler of China, even when her husband was alive. And under her, China began to control more of Korea. Like, talking about Korean Peninsula right there. They pretty much take over all of it by that time. And I think under her, she actually began to kind of spread Buddhism throughout China. She actually began building like various temples throughout China. And she's considered a great empress, but I've heard she's kind of ruthless in power as ruler. They also have another ruler here, Emperor Zonzong, of course. He's like another emperor that was one of the last major ones they have of the Tang Dynasty. He reigned more into the 8th century CE, and he is considered one of the longest reigning rulers of the Tang Dynasty, about 43 years. He stayed in power. He is one of the ones that they think that helped to kind of develop the capital of Chang'an, which I told you was a million-man city, like one of the first in the world to be built. And it was a huge city. I think according to statistics I've read, the city may have been about 30 square miles in size, which was much larger than the Ming version of Chang'an later. Its walls on average were 18 feet tall. And population varies, I know, but I think that maybe anywhere from 1 to 2 million, I think, is how large they think the city was at that point. So that was kind of like the peak of the Tang Dynasty. I think he was like considered one of the last great rulers they had. And then after that, the Tang Dynasty began to decline. Another thing that's very famous about this time as well, I wanted to mention about imperial China, was that under the Chinese, they began to build what they call the Grand Canal, or China's Grand Canal, as it's called. It was built kind of like around the Sui Dynasty and the Tang. It was pretty much completed, although I think it was extended up to early modern times by other dynasties. And the Grand Canal is important because it's this intercoastal canal system that connects the Yellow with the Yangtze rivers. I've got a map kind of showing the actual locations of basically the actual canal. You can see from Beijing, the canal goes all the way down the eastern coast of China, down to where the Hangzhou is in Shanghai. So it connects these river basins. And that's very important. The reason why the Grand Canal is important because it facilitated better trade, faster trade also as well. The length on the actual canal varies, but I think it's up to almost 1,200 miles in length. Well, at least the original canal that was built in. I think the canal today is, I think, much larger because they added on to it and so on. And so today, like the People's Republic of China, it's still pretty important overall. Of course, in Louisiana, we have these intercoastal canals as well, like we have along our coast, and a lot of countries have canals in it to help facilitate trade and also commerce, etc. Now, what happened in later China? I'm probably not going to be, of course, talking about, China today. Here's kind of a map showing you the Su, and Tang dynasties, and you can see Chang'an in the middle of that map right there. But um, I'm going to get to it later, but we'll get to the Middle Ages. But China's going to decline. It's going to get invaded by foreign powers. The Mongols are going to come in the 13th century and literally take over China. They'll under Genghis Khan, about him, of course. And he has his own dynasty called the Yuan Dynasty that takes over between the 13th and 14th centuries. You may have heard of Emperor Kublai Khan that reigned at one point in the late 13th century. The Mongols wiped out half of China, like killed half the people. I think the Mongols committed the most genocide in history, wiping out whole populations throughout Eurasia. And so that's part of why later the Chinese put so much emphasis on building the Great Wall, which you can see behind me, of course, right here. And so they have later, like the Ming was in power from 14th century to the 17th century, which is another great dynasty, which is more into the Middle Ages and modern China as a whole. And then they had another dynasty called the Qing, or also called the Great Qin Dynasty. That was the so-called Manchu that were in Manchuria. They actually invaded in the 17th century when China was going through a massive civil war in its country. And they eventually overthrew and took over the state. And of course, that made the Great Wall of China, of course, obsolete, which you're seeing. The Qing Dynasty was in power till 1912, but if you get to like 19th century, early 20th century, China is really controlled a lot by foreign powers. European powers, even Japan, comes in and tries to take over, China at the time. And China eventually in 1912 will become a republican state. You got the Republic of China that forms in 1912 and will remain in power till around World War II. And then after Japan invaded China during World War II, you had also the People's Republic of China that formed in 1949, of course, which is a socialist state founded by, of course, Mao Zedong, of course, the founder of that particular state. And that's the current, state, of course, that controls China, the People's Republic of China. People call it communist or socialist, I guess, basically. It's one of our major rivals, the United States, of course, here today economically. So anyway, that's kind of a history, of ancient China overall. And I kind of talk about some of the modern stuff a little bit, but that's going to, of course, end this part 2 lecture, of course, on China. As I said, I'm not going to test this particular 2 lectures on China in a quiz right now. We'll, of course, kind of shelve that for later, but this will be part of course, our upcoming second exam, which might be at the end of next week, possibly, if I can get to it or not, because I'm going to include China with the Greeks. That's going to be our 2 topics. That's going to be on the second exam overall. I am going to include later in the week, Friday, a 2-part recorded lecture on ancient India. That will go towards a quiz, of course, which I'll be posting probably on Friday sometime. But I'm not going to lecture live, of course, on ancient India because we're kind of behind, I know, a little bit in the semester. So next week, of course, week 5, I'm going to move on to talk about the ancient Greeks. So that's it for the week. It doesn't look like anybody has any questions about anything right now. But if you have any comments, questions, about the class, please, let me know on my channel. I guess any time of day or night, whatever. If you have a question about the class, you can always email me as well. But don't forget, you do have various assignments which are still due that are out there. Of course, the big thing, first exam, of course, this week is one of the things you need to start concentrating on, trying to wrap that up. And then, of course, the first vocab assignment, that's been out a while. You need to try to wrap that up. That's supposed to be due today, of course, Wednesday, September 15th. And I have posted already the second vocab overall. So that's it for today. I hope you all have a great weekend, of course, coming up. No live lecture Friday, of course. I'll have the lectures on India that are previously recorded from before. So y'all take care, and of course, have a great week overall.